Long before the hum of industrial machines filled vast factory floors, every single piece of clothing worn by every single person was made entirely by hand. From the humblest peasant tunic to the finest royal gown, the process of turning raw materials into wearable garments was one of the most time-consuming and labor-intensive tasks in medieval life. It could take weeks, sometimes even months, to produce a single outfit, and yet people managed to clothe entire kingdoms without a single factory in sight. So how exactly did they do it? To understand medieval clothing production, we need to start not in a workshop, but in a field. Because before anyone could sew a single stitch, they first needed fibre. And getting that fibre was a job in itself. For most of medieval Europe, the two primary sources of textile fibre were wool and flax. Wool came from sheep, which were raised across the continent in enormous numbers. England, in particular, built much of its medieval economy on wool production. Flax, on the other hand, was a plant grown in fields, and when processed, it produced linen, a lighter and cooler fabric that was especially popular for undergarments and summer clothing. Let us start with wool, since it was by far the most common textile of the medieval period. Every spring, sheep were sheared using iron blade shears, a process not unlike what is still done on farms today. The raw fleece that came off the sheep was greasy, dirty, and tangled. It was full of lanolin, a natural oil produced by the sheep's skin, along with dirt, twigs, and other debris from the animal's life outdoors. The first step in processing this wool was washing it. Women and children would typically take the raw fleece to a stream or river and scrub it repeatedly to remove the worst of the grease and grime. This was cold, wet, unpleasant work, but absolutely essential. Once the wool was clean and dry, it had to be carded. Carding was the process of pulling the tangled wool fibres through two flat boards covered in small metal teeth, similar to wire brushes. This straightened and aligned the fibres, preparing them for spinning. It was repetitive, tedious work, and it took hours to card even a small amount of wool. Then came spinning, which was arguably the most critical and time-consuming step in the entire process. Spinning transformed loose, fluffy wool fibres into a continuous thread strong enough to be woven into cloth. For most of the medieval period, spinning was done using a drop spindle, a simple tool consisting of a wooden shaft with a weighted disc at the bottom called a haul. The spinner would attach a length of fibre to the spindle, give it a twist, and let it drop, drawing out the fibres into a thin, even thread as gravity pulled the spindle downward. This required extraordinary skill and patience. A good spinner could produce a remarkably even thread, but the process was painfully slow. The spinning wheel, which most people associate with medieval life, actually did not become widespread in Europe until the 13th century, and even then, it took decades to fully replace the drop spindle in many regions. When it did arrive, it dramatically increased the speed of thread production, but spinning remained a full-time occupation for many women. In fact, the word spinster, which we now use to describe an unmarried woman, originally referred to a woman whose occupation was spinning thread. That is how central this task was to medieval life. It has been estimated that to keep a single weaver supplied with enough thread to work continuously, as many as 4 to 6 spinners had to work full-time producing yarn. This gives you a sense of just how much labour was required before a piece of cloth even began to take shape on a loom. Now let us talk about flax, the other major fibre of the medieval world. Processing flax into linen was, if anything, even more labour-intensive than processing wool. Flax plants were harvested by pulling them up from the ground by their roots, rather than cutting them. This preserved the full length of the fibres inside the stems. The harvested plants were then soaked in water for days or even weeks in a process called retting. Retting used bacteria and moisture to break down the outer layers of the plant stem, loosening the inner fibres. The smell was absolutely foul, and retting ponds were typically located far from homes and villages for exactly this reason. After retting, the flax stalks were dried and then beaten and scraped in a process called breaking and scutching. This removed the remaining woody outer material from the soft fibres inside. Finally, the fibres were combed through a series of increasingly fine metal combs in a process called hackling, which separated the long, fine fibres from the shorter, coarser ones. The long fibres, called line, were used for fine linen, while the shorter fibres, called tow, were used for rougher fabrics and rope. Only after all of this processing could the flax fibers be spun into linen thread using the same spinning methods as wool. Once enough thread had been produced, it was time for weaving. Medieval weaving was done on looms, and loom technology evolved significantly over the course of the medieval period. Early medieval weavers often used vertical warp-weighted looms where the threads of the warp, the vertical threads, hung downward and were held taut by clay or stone weights at the bottom. By the high medieval period, the horizontal treadle loom had become the standard in much of Europe. This was a significant technological advancement. The weaver sat at the loom and used foot pedals called treadles to raise and lower different sets of warp threads, creating a gap called a shed through which the horizontal weft thread could be passed using a shuttle. This was much faster than older methods and allowed weavers to produce broader and more complex fabrics. Weaving was a skilled trade, and by the high and late medieval periods, weavers had organized themselves into powerful guilds that controlled quality standards, training, and pricing. Becoming a master weaver required years of apprenticeship and the production of a masterpiece, a sample of cloth that demonstrated the weaver's skill to the satisfaction of the guild. But the cloth that came off the loom was not yet ready to wear. Raw woven fabric, especially wool, needed to go through several finishing processes. One of the most important was fulling. Fulling involved soaking the woven wool cloth in water mixed with a substance called fuller's earth, a type of clay, or sometimes stale urine, which acted as a degreasing agent. The cloth was then pounded and beaten, either by foot or from the 12th century onward by water-powered fulling mills. This process shrank the fabric, thickened it, and made it more durable and water-resistant by matting the fibers together. After fulling, the cloth was stretched on large wooden frames called tenters to dry evenly and maintain its shape. This is where we get the English expression on tenterhooks, meaning to be stretched with tension or anxiety. The surface of the cloth was then raised using teasels, the dried flower heads of a spiky plant, which were drawn across the fabric to pull up loose fibers. These raised fibers were then carefully sheared smooth with large iron shears, giving the cloth a soft, even finish. This process could be repeated several times to produce increasingly fine fabric. Finally, the cloth might be dyed. Medieval dyers used an astonishing range of natural substances to colour fabric. Woad and indigo produced blue. Madder root produced red. Weld and saffron produced yellow. Combining these dyes created greens, purples, and oranges. The most expensive dye was Tyrian purple, derived from sea snails, and certain deep reds and scarlets that required expensive imported ingredients like kermes or cochineal insects. Dyeing was a specialized and often secretive trade. Dyers' guilds closely guarded their recipes and techniques. The process involved mordanting the fabric first, treating it with metallic salts like alum to help the dye bond permanently to the fibers, and then submerging it in heated dye baths for extended periods. The color of a person's clothing was a direct indicator of their social status. Peasants typically wore undyed or muted natural tones because bright, vivid dyes were expensive. Nobles and royalty, on the other hand, wore rich blues, deep reds, and brilliant purples precisely because these colors demonstrated their wealth and status. Only after all of these steps, shearing, washing, carding, spinning, weaving, fulling, finishing, and dyeing, was the cloth ready to be cut and sewn into actual garments. Tailoring itself was yet another skilled trade, and tailors worked with shears and needles to cut and stitch fabric into tunics, hose, cloaks, gowns, and all the other garments of the medieval wardrobe. When you consider the full chain of production from sheep in a field to a finished garment on someone's back, it becomes clear why clothing was so incredibly valuable in the medieval world. People owned very few garments. Clothes were repaired, patched, handed down through families, and even listed in wills as valuable possessions. Stealing clothing was a serious crime, and used clothing was a thriving trade in every medieval city. The next time you open your wardrobe and consider dozens of mass-produced garments, remember that for most of human history, a single shirt represented weeks of back-breaking, highly skilled labour performed by an entire chain of specialised workers, from the shepherd to the spinner to the weaver to the dyer to the tailor. Every thread told a story. Every garment was a small miracle of human effort and ingenuity.